Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be back at Leo Back Temple and to be greeted by Dottie and who reminded me of the first time we met back in 1994 with her late husband Maury. And those of you who are joining us who are not from LA, Maury Fromson was a legendary award-winning journalist who was one of my mentors, and he taught a whole generation of journalists about journalism. He covered wars, and he was also very well known for establishing the organization that protects journalists when they're in danger. And I'm so happy to see we have friends here from Winnipeg. Robin, I see we have friends here from Cleveland. We have people here from Israel, and basically from all over the world. So it's a wonderful and a very eclectic group. People ask me about the new political realities in Israel, and I can tell you that the main concern that people have is the apparent or the perceived instability of the political system. After all, we finished an unprecedented period in Israel's history of tremendous instability. We went through four cycles of national elections. We've never had that in our history. It's true that even before this period of instability, the average lifespan of a coalition was a little bit over 2 years. And it doesn't really change the average that much, but still there's a sense of chaos. There's a sense that we'll talk about that. And Israelis are very, very concerned. And the observers, the people that are looking at Israel from the outside, are also very concerned. The most frequent question that I encounter is, how will this government survive? It has only a majority of one vote. It's 60 versus 59. And so what I would like to do today, with your permission, is to do two things, basically. One is to give you a quick overview about the system in Israel, some differences, structural differences than the system that you know in the United States or even in Canada. We have some Canadians on this call. And then to give you some of my projections for Israel's future. So when you look at the Israeli system from a structural point of view, what other people may see as a chronically unstable political system is actually a very robust democracy. It's a very robust democracy that survived a major attempt to destabilize its fundamentals and its foundations. And I think that the fact that Israel managed to avoid a fifth national elections cycle and the fact that this coalition was created, the fact that they were able to put together this coalition is proof positive as to the solid nature of Israel's democracy. When you look at the overall structure of the system, it's very similar to the American system, right? You have the three branches. You have the executive branch, the judicial branch, the legislative branch. There's tension between them. In Israel, the judicial branch is becoming increasingly more and more important because the legislative branch is declining. It's declining in the quality of the people that are attracted to politics. We'll talk about that, why the legislators all over the world are not being viewed or being upheld to that standard of years past. It's a very interesting question, has a lot to do, in my view, with the impact of technology on politics and the fact that people that are drawn to politics are slightly different than the people that used to be drawn to politics 50 and 60 and 70 years ago. But in any event, when you look at that structure, then you could say Israel is very much similar to the American system. But let me tell you, you couldn't find two systems that are more different. These are a partial list of the fundamental differences between Israel and the United States. The first is, of course, that in Israel we don't have a constitution. What we do have is the Proclamation of Independence, and the Proclamation of Independence serves as the inspiration to the system, right? It talks about equality, it talks about the rights, basic rights of people, but the idea of the people that formed the first Knesset back in 1948, 1949 is that instead of trying to present one document that will be undoubtedly controversial, and probably the legal effort will be derailed by political opposition and political discourse. Rather than doing that, what they proposed is let's gradually introduce a series of basic laws, and those basic laws one day will amount to a full constitution. So we are now 73 years old, and we are in the midst of the process of drafting this book of basic laws. So there's basic laws already were drafted and already were passed. And so that's the first big difference. The second big difference is that in Israel, unlike in the United States, we don't have a separation between religion and state. And that's a source of a great deal of tension and friction between the various tribes within Israeli society. Many Americans, when they look at the prime minister, I just had it last week when I was in Salt Lake City, I was addressing a group of state treasurers and a lot of people that personally like Netanyahu very much, were disappointed Netanyahu is no longer the prime minister. And they spoke to me as if making the comparison between the prime minister and the American president, assuming that the Israeli prime minister has some presidential powers. So it may come as a surprise to you to know that in Israel, the prime minister has no presidential powers. The prime minister, from a legal point of view, first of all, is first among equals, is being upheld to a much higher legal standard than the average citizen. Secondly, he's not the commander in chief. He's not the diplomat in chief. He is the person who's heading the coalition structure. And the big chunk of his time goes to the maintenance of his or her coalition. I say her because we had a female prime minister whose name is Golda Meir, and you can see her picture right here. I'm reminded, I'll tell you a story. Back in May of 2003, Ariel Sharon came to visit New York. He was the prime minister. And I remember when he just arrived, he stayed at the Palace Hotel in New York. And when he arrived and at his hotel suite, I happened to be there. I walked in with his staff. And even before he could get something to drink, they gave him a list of phone numbers that he had to call back home in Israel. It was a long list. And the prime minister of the state of Israel sat there and called each number. And you wouldn't believe the kind of calls that he had to make. He had to call someone who's a member of Likud, or Kadima, whatever party it was. His son had a bar mitzvah, and he had to make tens of calls like that every day to maintain the coalition structure. So a big part of the job of being a prime minister in Israel is actually the very delicate task of keeping your coalition intact. You don't have any absolute powers. Not only that, the prime minister in Israel has two things that he can do without any approval of the cabinet. The cabinet, in fact, is the commander-in-chief in Israel. And that is to appoint the head of the Mossad and the head of the Secret Service. These are the only two organizations that by law are directly under the authority of the prime minister. Because of Israel's socialist history and socialist background, and the socialist infrastructure was created back in the 1920s with the creation of the Histadrut, the trade union, with the creation of the Haganah in 1920. The business government relations are still heavily regulated. Some people say that's the reason why Israel was able to safely, more or less safely, sail through the stormy waters of the economic meltdown of 2008, 2009. But other people are very critical of it, claiming that it adds a tremendous, as you call it in America, red tape, and Israel is not a very business-friendly environment. My dear friend David Milch, she's here on the call, is doing a lot of business in Israel, and he can tell you that Israel is certainly a place where you can work and do business. Contrary to the common belief, and I know that the people are exposed to shows like Shtisel and Unorthodox and so on, and there is this image that Israel is extremely religious. Well, I can tell you, as someone who spent significant time in both countries, Israel is far more secular than the United States as a nation. It's true that there are many religious groups, and Israel is a country that has tremendous respect to religiosity and religion in general, not only Judaism. It's the safest place for Christians to be in the Middle East, for example. It's not such a pleasant experience to be a Christian these days in any of our neighboring countries. But Israel is something like "In God We Trust" would never pass in Israel. Um, and the most important difference, while in the United States, and I know I'm saying this right after Joe Biden was able to get some Republican support for his infrastructure bill, and that's a great achievement for bipartisanship. But while in the United States, the gravitation is towards the extremes, in Israel, the gravitation is towards the center. To be a centrist in Israel is the place you want to be. That's where the votes are. That's why people are so ambiguous about their positions on the Palestinian issue or other issues they don't want to commit. Why? Because they want to be in the center. That's where you want to be. And if you're not at the center, it's not a good, you can't really build a significant political capital. Now, in Israel, unlike the United States, the right to be elected is sacred. That's why we have people that are convicted felons. We have a Minister of Interior, former Minister of Interior, who spent time in jail, was released from jail, went back into politics. The right to be elected in Israel is sacred. And this is something that many people don't understand. In Israel, the Knesset is the sovereign, the legislator. It's a 120-member organization. In order to form a coalition, in order to be able to govern, you have to put together a coalition that has at least 61 seats out of 120. The parties that enter the Knesset are the parties that were able to pass the threshold, which is normally around 170, 180,000 votes would give you the threshold to get into the Knesset. And then from a legal point of view, I'm sure you're all familiar with the process. The coalition formation timeline starts with the president of the state of Israel, who usually is only a ceremonial position, but when it comes to that national election cycle, the president has a real function, a real role. The president now, Isaac Herzog, before that was Reuven Rivlin. He chooses the head of the party that won the most votes, gives them the mandate. They have 28 days to do it. Benjamin Netanyahu, if you remember, failed to form a 61-member coalition 3 times in a row. He was bailed out by Benny Gantz, and then finally he was replaced by the current coalition. This is the picture of the division of the power in the current Israeli Knesset. In blue, you can see the anti-Netanyahu bloc. In red, the pro-Netanyahu bloc. In the middle, you have 11 uncommitted seats that belong to 2 groups. I mean, for the time of that report, they were uncommitted. What you have de facto is the following. It's true that the current government, headed by Naftali Bennett, whom we'll discuss in a second, has only 60 seats officially. But unofficially, they enjoy the support of the Arab parties from the outside. So what you're actually looking at here is a coalition that is relying on a majority of at least 68, maybe 67, because there's one member of the coalition that may move to the other side. But the support that they have is actually pretty solid, considering the fact that Menachem Begin, for example, in 1982, went into Lebanon with only 59 members of the Knesset. Ehud Barak went to Camp David with 39 members in his coalition. It is possible to function as a minority government if you have the support from the outside. In the case of Menachem Begin in 1982, in June of 1982, Menachem Begin had the support of labor, because labor believed that it was the right thing to go into Lebanon. So labor supported Menachem Begin. And so the coalition enjoys the support of the Arab parties. And I cannot even begin to tell you how significant that is, that the Arab parties feel part of the government, one party of the 3 parts. There are 2 major factions. One of them, the smaller one, which is the more radical one ideologically, actually joined the coalition and is getting access to the budget. And we're talking about tens of billions of shekels that will actually be funneled and channeled to the Arab community. I can't even begin to tell you how important this is for Israel's future, because Israel's future is relying upon the successful integration of two groups. First is the ultra Orthodox, and the second is the Arab Israelis. And I have my dear friend here on the call, Sidney Gottesman from some MasterCard, who's on the ground in Israel, working to develop, that reality that will allow everybody to participate in that in the Israeli economy. The onslaught on Israeli constitutionalism is the main reason why Benjamin Netanyahu is no longer the prime minister. And in Israel, constitutionalism in Hebrew, mamlachtiyut, is a concept that was coined, I would say, almost by David Ben-Gurion. David Ben-Gurion built Israeli constitutionalism around national institutions such as the military, such as his approach to the Jewish tradition and Jewish holidays was very unique. He gave them new meaning. For example, Shavuos, that in America is Chag Matan Torah, right? That's where it has a religious meaning. In Israel, he turned it into Chag HaBikurim, is the holiday for the farmers and the celebration of the crops and so on. But the institutions that were targeted by Netanyahu, beginning in the Knesset, in his the Knesset committees, certainly the state comptroller, the ministries themselves, and the court system, which is something that bothered many Israelis, the attack against the court system and the attacks against his own attorney general, the person that he himself appointed. Many Israelis had zero tolerance to such an onslaught. And I think that what we've seen here in Israel in the past 2.5 years, weekly demonstrations against the prime minister, we haven't had that in Israel since the Lebanon War, since 1982, when Menachem Begin was under tremendous public pressure to resign, and eventually he did resign in 1983. Right now, the party the coalition consists of 8 different parties, and this coalition is a very unique coalition. We have, for the first time in Israel's history, 9 females serving in the cabinet, which is 33%. It's true, it's not 50, but we're on our way to get to 50%. We have the first LGBT head of party. And as I mentioned before, the first time in Israel's history where an Islamist party, not just an Arab party, an Islamist party, a party that ideologically allies itself with the Islamic Brotherhood from Egypt, is part of the governing coalition and has access to national budgets. Now, people ask me about the stability of this coalition, and I tell them that it's true that Benjamin Netanyahu is no longer the prime minister, but strangely, he is still the most important person in the Israeli political system. And how so? He is the glue that keeps all those 8 different parties together. When you look at the list of people here, they all have one thing in common. All of them do not want to see him as the prime minister. Ideologically, it's a very odd combination. Nothing brings Lieberman and Abbas together. Lieberman is a hardcore conservative. Abbas is a leader of a radical Arab party. Nothing could have brought them together. Only a magician, and that magician is Benjamin Netanyahu. And those 8 parties, the only thing that keeps them together is the fact they don't want to see Netanyahu around, which brings us to a very awkward, bizarre conclusion, which is, as long as Benjamin Netanyahu sticks around, this coalition is safe. It's as simple as that. As long as Benjamin Netanyahu does not step aside, does not retire from political life, this coalition is very, very safe. And there are no indications that Netanyahu is planning retirement anytime soon. It looks like, and the big test is, of course, the ability to pass the budget. It looks like this coalition is going to be able to pass the national budget, which in Israel, passing the budget is a bill, is a piece of legislation that they have to do every year or every other year. When you look at Netanyahu's 12 years, and we'll talk about um, many of his achievements, um, you can see almost two opposites. On the one hand, you see clearly two areas where Israel is clearly on path to progress during his 12 years. The first is Israel's international standing, which is unprecedented. We'll talk about that in a second. The second is Israel's economy. It's true that Israel is still suffering from some major fundamental challenges. For example, we're unable to attract the foreign direct investment that we should be able to attract, but Israel's economy is robust. Israel's economy is solid, is withstood some major global challenges. And Netanyahu certainly should get credit for it. He was the prime minister during that time. But on the other hand, you have another dimension to his 12 years, where a serious lack of progress is evident. And the first, of course, of those issues is the issue of Iran, which was Netanyahu's flagship issue. He rallied around the Iran issue. He spent imaginary amounts of money on the Iran issue, and of course, Iran has never been closer to military nuclear capabilities. It is perhaps the biggest diplomatic failure in Israel's history. And I say diplomatic because Israel voluntarily, under Netanyahu, gave up on the opportunity to influence the Iran deal and walked away. And this is something that is not done in the world of diplomacy. That's why there is diplomacy. That's all, diplomacy is all about the ability to have a seat around the table and to influence. And of course, when you look at Hamas and Hezbollah, both of them have never been stronger. Hezbollah amassed an imaginary amount of missiles and rockets. They're in the position to turn our life into a living hell, only if they wanted to. And again, another major failure, I call it the area of no progress. So there are two types of Netanyahus: the one that has a clear path to progress, and the one that cannot show much progress at the same time. The three things that really characterize his 12 years, which Israelis liked and disliked at the same time. Israelis liked the fact that Netanyahu was risk averse, and that's, and in many ways it's a good thing. But when you only see risk and you ignore opportunities, it also could lead to stagnation and not to say paralysis. And the second thing, he was his biggest talent was his ability to set the national agenda by using the national media. He did it very, very wisely on a daily basis. By the way, even as the head of the opposition, is still trying to do it. For example, we had a wonderful young lady who won the gold medal in gymnastics in Tokyo, a lady by the name of Linoy Ashram. And usually, when we have an Israeli athlete winning a gold medal in the Olympics, the prime minister is calling that person to congratulate them. Or when you have the basketball team winning the European Championship, usually that's the prime minister. Netanyahu, of course, called her as if he's still the prime minister. There are reports in the Israeli media that members of Likud are being instructed to call him Mr. Prime Minister, although he's no longer the prime minister. So he's still trying to set the agenda. It will be gradually more and more difficult for him to do as the national media will shift its focus to the current coalition. And lastly, which is something that I think applies also to the United States. Very easy today using social media platforms. If you have budgets, if you have the budget, it's very easy to create the illusion as if a certain politician has a massive base. In Israel, there was a very successful spin put on the political discourse that said basically if Netanyahu will be ousted, the events of January 6th, 2021 in Washington, D.C. will be nothing as to compares to what you will be seeing in Jerusalem. Tens of thousands of people will storm the streets, and this is not going to go peacefully. And guess what? The night Netanyahu was ousted, 120 people showed up in front of the prime minister's residence. That was the extent of the riots that they were promising us. And the point I'm trying to make is it's so easy to create an illusion of a mighty political base using Instagram, using Facebook, using Twitter. And there's a real disconnect between that world that exists in social media, that sphere, and real life on the ground. On the ground, people have to go to work. People have to make a living. People have to take care of their families. And the whole notion of tens of thousands of people that will be marching the streets of Jerusalem proved to be completely wrong, not even remotely close. Again, the balance of good governance, and I say that as someone who was in diplomacy for many years. Diplomacy tilts towards opportunity. There are two ways to look at the world. One way is to say, I wake up in the morning, I'm the prime minister of the state of Israel, and I'm looking for opportunities for my country to grow, opportunities for my country to excel, opportunities to, to evolve into something bigger and better. And there are different types of people that wake up in the morning and all they see is risks and threats. And yeah, there has to be a balance between the two. If you're only about opportunities, then the danger is that you will be leading a reckless, haphazardly put together foreign policy. If you're only about risk, as I mentioned before, the danger is that you will lead your country to stagnation and paralysis. And I think that Israelis maybe were unable to articulate that, but I think that many Israelis felt that there was too much emphasis on risks and threats and less on opportunities. And when the opportunities were presented, like the Abraham Accords, they were presented by the United States and not by Israel. So the Abraham Accords, for example, is a wonderful testimony to the power of American diplomacy, not necessarily not necessarily Israeli diplomacy. Although Israel cultivated ties with the Gulf countries for decades, it was the U.S. administration that sealed the deal and presented the roadmap to the normalization agreements. Netanyahu himself, by the way, just to remind you, 3 weeks before the Abraham Accords were announced, he announced that he wanted to annex parts of the Jordan Rift Valley. A lot of people ask me about Netanyahu's indictments and Netanyahu's trial. The trial is already going on for several months now. People ask me, is it about cigars and champagnes? And I tell them, read the accusations. The Israeli Attorney General, appointed by Netanyahu, published a 65-page document which lists all the accusations. These are very serious accusations. Is being accused of bribe, an attempt to bribe, and is being accused of deceiving and breach of trust. And there's a whole, I don't want to go into this, but it's not about champagne and cigars. Believe me, very serious allegations. And it's important if you care about Israel, if you care about Mr. Netanyahu, if you want to know what will happen, I urge you to read the list of accusations. The new Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett, is a very interesting phenomenon in Israeli political life for the very simple reason he has no political base. He was voted into the Knesset as the head of a party that was able to win 7 seats. One of them already left, so he's left with 6. And if you compare that to Menachem Begin with his 40 plus, or Yitzhak Rabin with his nearly 50 seats, it's a person who is not very popular in Israel. Is very young, relatively inexperienced. And as a precedent, he reminds us a lot of Ehud Olmert. Ehud Olmert was, we call him the accidental prime minister. He was never, there was never in the cards for him to be a prime minister. And then Ariel Sharon got his brain aneurysm, and Ehud Olmert became prime minister overnight. and um, and immediately was tested by Hezbollah from the north. And I gave a similar talk a few months ago, just as when Naftali Bennett assumed the role of prime minister, and I said, no doubt in my mind, he will be tested, and indeed, he was tested, and we are being tested right now by Hezbollah, as I predicted, as well as by Iran attacking Israeli vessels or Israeli-owned vessels in the Red Sea or in other parts of the world. So he has no base. He has no popularity, but he was given the chance of a lifetime to build a real political base, to build public support, and to do the right thing. And he's already starting it. And I have to say, I'm very impressed by the way Naftali Bennett is handling himself as a young man who hasn't really held executive positions before. It was very briefly the Minister of Defense for a couple of months. He was the Minister of Education. But and the Ministry of Education is a massive economic system, but he was not in a position to make decisions such as the decision the Prime Minister is expected to make. And I have to say, I'm very, very impressed. I'll give you an example on the issue of COVID. He announced that there is a need for Israel to learn to live with the virus, and that lockdown is not a long-term sustainable solution. Now, how many leaders do you know in the world that have the guts to say it in the face of hysteria in the national media? And make no mistake, the Israeli media is completely hysterical when it comes to COVID-19. And I think that Naftali Bennett is right. I think that societies and governments have to find a way to function and let the economy work with the virus, protect the people that need protections, and that's his approach. And I think that's admirable that he's not afraid to say those things. And I have to say that personally, I'm very impressed. And I forgot to mention that unlike Netanyahu, he's practicing what we call informational distancing. You don't see him every day in prime time. He's not trying to aggressively set the national agenda. When COVID-19 broke out, Netanyahu basically appeared every night, prime time from 8 to 9, setting the agenda himself. Bennett is not doing it. Bennett is maintaining a lower profile. And I think that so far, at least as public opinion surveys indicate, the Israeli public is very happy with his performance and very happy with the fact that the government is working in harmony. Believe it or not, those 8 parties that were put together by Yair Lapid, they work in harmony. What will be the priority for this coalition? They're already starting doing it because of the ideological differences. And the ideological differences are dramatic. We've never had anything like it in Israeli politics, that our opposites came together. Dramatic ideological differences. It leaves them the domestic agenda. And that's where you will see most of the effort. Building infrastructure mostly, we'll talk about that. Rehabilitating the relationship between the Israeli legislator and the Israeli court system. The legal system is extremely important in Israel, and so on. So you'll see more of that happening. On the geopolitical side, again, don't expect this coalition to provide a dramatic breakthrough with the Palestinians. Not going to happen. It will not change the policy on Iran in a dramatic way, other than becoming part of the conversation, meaning they will be better coordinated with the Biden administration that Netanyahu was coordinated with the Obama administration. Again, on the issue of the Palestinians, don't expect any progress. They'll have to definitely continue what the Trump administration started with the normalization agreements. I think that everybody, of course, is waiting for the Saudis to make a move. I think that this government will be today. The foreign minister Yair Lapid is in Morocco. And you have to remember that Morocco, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan are 3 Arab countries that are given by Israel access to the day-to-day management of the holy sites to Islam in Jerusalem, because all 3 royal families claim that they're descendants of the Prophet Muhammad. And we respect that claim, and we work very closely with the Moroccans, with the Jordanians, with the Hashemites, and with the Saudis. And so everybody's waiting for Saudi Arabia to be the next big thing. I think that it will definitely be a major achievement for both the Biden administration and the Lapid-Bennett government. And I say Lapid-Bennett government because we have to remember that Yair Lapid is the most important person in this coalition. He's the person who put it together. He is the political mastermind behind this 8-party coalition. Undercurrents, Israeli society, as I mentioned before, Israelis are bothered with, and I think that the same thing applies in the United States and in Canada. COVID-19 exposed the inability and the ineptitude of governments to deal with a crisis of that magnitude. And so it creates a sense of chaos. Also, there was a certain Netanyahu fatigue. It's been around since the mid-1990s. It's been a long time. And of course, the impact of information overload, which I believe I discussed already with this group a while ago. But let me just say 2 words about it because this is of critical importance. What happens is that we are being bombarded with information. Our brain was never designed to handle so much information. And what happens is that we feel overwhelmed. We're unable to handle so many stimulations simultaneously. And what happens when we are being bombarded in such a way, when we're overwhelmed, the level of anxiety goes up. We have a tendency to make mistakes. But more importantly, we develop a yearning, a craving almost, for simplicity in the face of complexity. In other words, people are looking for simple solutions to highly complex problems. And that's how you end up with Brexit. That's how you end up with building a wall with Mexico, which sounds perfect on paper. It's completely, not undoable, cannot do that. It's not something that can be done effectively. This is not the way to solve, complex issues. And I can give you many other examples. So what happens is that information overload flattens the conversation. There's no place for nuance. There's no place for a deep discussion. The political discourse is losing its impact as a result. And you see it on Twitter, you see it on Instagram, you see it on Facebook. Politicians take advantage of it, those of them who understand the art of the soundbite. And that's how you end up with a fatigued audience. And that's exactly what happened in Israel. And I think to a large degree from what I'm hearing from my friends in the United States, that's the thing that bothered them, among others, about the previous administration, that it really generated too much noise. There was always something going on. There was always a lot of noise. And there's people who just want to have some peace and tranquility, some, as Seinfeld said, serenity now. Right? So people want just some peace and tranquility. Go back to where we are, and a few words about the future. And again, a lot of credit goes to Netanyahu here. When you look at the Middle East today, you see a clear decline in the intensity and the magnitude of the conventional threats that Israel is facing. Of the 23 members of the Arab League, about 6 countries, 6 of the 23 members have disintegrated in the past 10, 11 years, certainly since the outbreak of the so-called Arab Spring. So you have Syria, that used to present a major military threat to Israel, is disintegrating. Lebanon is busy with its own internal problems, massive internal problems. Egypt has developed a tremendous intimacy with Israel. We're working with Egypt in a way that we've never did before. I mean, it's incredibly intimate. The relationship with Jordan is improving now when Bennett and Lapid are in charge. It wasn't so good when Netanyahu was around. And of course, the normalization agreements and so on. And I can go on. We don't have time to go and to provide you with the rundown of every country in the region. But I can tell you that from a military point of view, when you look at the threat, the physical threat to Israel, there is a sharp decline in the conventional military capabilities of the Arab countries around us. Opposite to that, of course, we'll talk about the Iran nuclear aspirations and, of course, non-state actors like Hezbollah and Hamas that are gaining in popularity and gaining in military capabilities. Again, another credit that goes to Netanyahu is the unprecedented level of intimacy with the world's greatest powers. So it's not just Israel's ties with the United States that traditionally have been very robust and very solid, but it's also Israel's ties with India. It's Israel's ties with China, Israel's ties with Brazil, and other countries that we don't think of as major players in the world. But Nigeria, for example, Israel has extremely intimate ties with Nigeria, Australia, Canada, and I can go on and on and on. And then, of course, countries in Europe. Israel is projected to grow massively like no other country in the Western world. Today, we're 9.2 million people. We're projected to be 17.5 million people by 2048. When the state of Israel will celebrate 100 years, we're going to have over 17 million Israelis. And I know those of you on the call, I know some of you are contemplating to move to Israel, and some of you already moved to Israel, like my friend Sydney. This is the time, my friends, if you have a few shekels aside, this is the time to buy an apartment in Israel. Israel is boomtown. Israel now is what Los Angeles was in the 1960s, Dodi. This is the time to buy real estate. Of course, Israel achieved the level of independence when it comes to water production, which is unbelievable. When the state of Israel was founded, the founding fathers of Israel did not view the Arab aggression as the number one existential threat to the Zionist enterprise. They viewed lack of water as the biggest threat. That's why David Ben-Gurion was so fascinated with with TVA, with the Tennessee Valley Authority. I don't know if you know that, but in the early 1950s, David Ben-Gurion traveled to Tennessee. That's where he met the late Guilford Glazer. Those of you who remember Guilford Glazer was a great philanthropist in Los Angeles and a real estate developer. The young Guilford Glazer was assigned to show Ben-Gurion around. He was from Tennessee, from Knoxville. And Ben-Gurion was fascinated with TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, because he wanted to duplicate what was done in the TVA and bring it to Israel, and he did. And the Hamovila Artzi, which is Israel's water system, is modeled after TVA. And some 20 years ago, Ariel Sharon's government made a decision to invest in desalination against the advice of the economists, by the way, that said that it would make water a very expensive commodity and it's not worth it. It's easier to buy water from Turkey or from other sources. But Ariel Sharon said no, and today we have 5 desalination plants. We pump water from the Mediterranean. We process the water and we use it. 85% of it goes to agriculture. Some 50% of the water goes to household consumption. But the most important thing is this: Israel today is 100% independent when it comes to the production of water. It's of huge strategic importance. It means that from from an historical point of view, Zionism was able to find a solution to the number one pressing issue that the Zionism had in this place from the day of the early pioneers that came here. I can't even begin to tell you how important this is. Same thing goes for energy. One of the biggest problems that Israel had strategically is the fact that Israel had to rely on Egypt, for example, to buy natural gas. Israel had to rely on other countries. Today, thanks to discoveries of massive deposits of natural gas and oil in the Mediterranean, Israel is on the verge of becoming completely 100% energy independent. Knowledge-based economy, again, was the dream of Ben-Gurion, was the dream of Albert Einstein, the founder of the Hebrew University in 1925. Israel today is one of the most robust knowledge-based economies. What does it mean when your economy is relying on knowledge and not on natural resources, not on tangibles, but rather on intangibles? It means that you are very resilient. That's the most important thing. Israeli economy is extremely resilient because it is based on knowledge and not um, on natural resources. Israel today is one of the emerging hubs of creativity. I would say that looking into the future, I think that Israel's future is extremely bright. Again, especially if we're able to successfully integrate the Orthodox and the Arabs into the community, turn them into part of the labor market, turn them into a part of the educational miracle. And my relative Karen Weinberg here is on the call. She is teaching at the Rupin Academy, where she has many of her students are Arab. And so Israel is a hub of creativity, but not only in high tech. I know that there's a very popular conversation going on about Israel prowess in the field of high tech and the startup nation and so on, and that's all true. But let's not miss the most important point. Israeli creativity is manifested in all walks of life, not only in high tech. Israeli creativity can be found in lifestyle and leisure. For example, the rise of the Israeli cuisine, the rise of the Israeli wine industry. In the environment, the way the Israelis deal with environmental challenge. It's true that Israel has a very tiny, insignificant ecological footprint, but Israel could become a major part of the solution to ecological problems and environmental problems, as is happening. Some of the innovation coming out of Israel is just unbelievable. Israel, of course, is a hub of creativity when it comes to immigration absorption. We're the only country in the world that actually went to Africa to bring people. And the way we absorb them, the way we turn them into part of the Israeli collective, I think is remarkable. And of course, I mentioned science and tech. Again, my friend, Dr. David Milch on the call is a veteran investor in Israeli healthcare industry, and he can attest to it personally. Arts and culture. Did you know, you're in LA, did you know that Israel is the third largest provider of content to Hollywood today? Amazing. What does it mean? It means that Israeli talent, Israeli creative minds finally discovered the way to tell a story in a compelling fashion. So you see it in early works like In Treatment, that was remade by HBO, or Homeland, that was remade by Showtime, and today you have Fauda and Shtisel and shows like that. And of course, last but not least is healthcare. The challenges for the future are also massive. The first challenge is how to be more attractive in terms of the ability to draw direct investment. It's still the perception of Israel as a place that is not safe, that is not stable, is a huge impediment. Israel is not attracting enough foreign money. You can see here the numbers. 2019 ended with nearly 20 billion. It's nothing for a country like Israel that has the third largest contingent on NASDAQ. We should be able to attract more, way more. I'm talking about tens of billions every year, if not more than that. Another challenge, of course, is the delegitimization of Israel. There are people out there that say that Israel has no right to exist. There are media institutions that may not say this specifically, explicitly, but would imply. I'll give you examples when, the coverage of the normalization agreements was unfair in a very radical way in the United States, not only in the United States, in Europe as well. There are, people take advantage of of the anti-Israel sentiment that is growing out there, and to basically doubt Israel's very right to exist. It's a very troubling trend, and I'll be more than happy to refer to that during the Q&A session. The recovery of the travel industry. Again, a lot of people talk about Startup Nation. It's true, but Startup Nation employs only 250,000 Israelis. The one single largest industry in Israel is the travel industry that employs 1.3 million Israelis. And so the recovery of the travel industry is the number one national priority. And because of the global travel restrictions, Israeli government wisely is emphasizing the need to boost domestic travel. So what you see today is a concentrated effort to try to market domestic destinations in Israel to the Israelis themselves. And it's working. Israelis are traveling again. Hotels are full. Restaurants are full. Life in Israel but it's not enough. We have to, pre-COVID-19, we were at the level of 5 million tourists a year. We need to get back there as soon as we can. Transportation infrastructure, again, Israel is experiencing tremendous growth, the fastest growth in the Western world because of natural growth. And as a result, transportation infrastructure is increasingly becoming inadequate, just like what you have in the United States. Yes, the other day they passed the transportation bill, the infrastructure bill. Same thing is needed here in Israel. That's a major challenge. We don't have enough train. We don't have enough highway. We don't have enough tunnels. All of those things will need to happen in the near future. And of course, healthcare infrastructure. I can tell you that there's no other word to use to describe what happened in Israel in the last 25 years than negligence. There's not one hotel, one new hospital that was built in the last 25 years, with the exception of Asuta in Ashdod, which is a private hospital. And Israel's population is massively growing, and we need more hospitals. We need more healthcare facilities in the country. Again, another major task for this government and the future governments. And of course, last but not least, is healing the social rifts. Information overload creates tribalism. Tribalism creates a system where there's less and less tolerance for the other. And digital tribalism is very, very dangerous. And it creates a real rift in society. So one of the main challenges of the Israeli society going forward is to heal those wounds, those debates, those discussions between the various tribes. Again, it's a long conversation. There are many, many tribes in Israel. A lot of people think that we have only 4 or 5 tribes, but there are tens of different tribes in Israel. And there's a need to create the common ground. Again, that's why when Ben Gurion came up with constitutionalism, that's what he had in mind. He said, what do they have in common? The Jew that just came from Poland and the Jew that just came from Yemen. And so, yeah, true, they're both Jewish, but they don't speak the same language. They don't have the same kind of religious ritual. Even the way they daven is different. So what do they have in common? So he created this idea of mamlachtiyut, of constitutionalism, and he put the IDF in the heart of it. So serving in the army became your ticket to Israelism. And now we're seeing the disintegration of Ben Gurion's constitutionalism. Again, one of the things that Netanyahu did very aggressively. And of course, the number one advantage going forward is the fact that Israel's DNA is all about boundless creativity. And that's really is the future. Today, we live in a world where there's a wide recognition that creativity rather than oil, creativity rather than gold, creativity rather than salt is the most important thing in the world. And thank God we have that in abundance. So we have challenges, but the future is bright. I think Israel is only the beginning of the takeoff. I think Israel as a brand has many problems, but also in terms of its overall wellness, it's very robust, it's very solid. And contrary to most political observers, I project that this government will do well and will survive all the attempts of the opposition to bring them down. And on this happy note, I'd like to open the discussion for your questions if you have any.
Okay, Ido, that's terrific. That was a primer, and we are so grateful. I think that's something I'd like to listen to over and over again. It's quite remarkable. Let's go to the chat. There were several questions. One of them is long enough that I'm going to let it wait a little bit. go to something that's a bit shorter. Where is my chat? Here it is. Okay. Let's go to something quick and short. How is Israel addressing the existential threat of global warming?
Well, as I said before, Israel is a small part of the problem, could be a big part of the solution. That should be the strategy. How Israel is coping with it, Israel hasn't met one of the problems that we had is the ethnocentric diplomatic policy of Israel. Climate change, until recently, was a non-issue in Israel. I'm sad to say that. As a diplomat, it always bothered me. I always spoke about it. But for Israeli decision makers, it was a non-issue. And this is the first government in Israel's history that is putting this issue on top of the agenda. So it remains to be seen if they're successful. But because of the fact that Israel had to deal with so many real existential threats, physical threats, and now conceptual threats like the delegitimizers, Israeli decision makers did not have the bandwidth to consider climate change as a big issue. And I think it's an historical mistake.
It's coming so fast that I think it's overtaking us, and we were blind to it, many of us. Another quick and short question, but then a longer after that. Gourmet Israeli ice cream that would replace Ben & Jerry's?
Oh yeah, we have an Israeli ice cream. Guess what the name of this ice cream is?
I have
Golda.
no idea.
Golda. Golda.
Golda.
Yes,
Golda.
there's Israeli ice cream called Golda.
Bravo.
And it's a phenomenal ice cream, by the way. Dangerous because it's so addictive. And I see oh my God, my dear friend Melvin Holmes is here from Bourne, Massachusetts, from Cape Cod. Hi, Melvin. Thank you for being here. Melvin went to school with me at Emerson College. Is my dear friend. He's from Malden, Massachusetts. All right, more.
Okay, another question
questions
for you. Are you ready for more?
I have all the time in the world. It's only 9 p.m. here.
All right. Is the rise of China and India reshaping Israel's alliance with the US and the West and inadvertently fueling the anti-Semitic narrative as BDS grows in the US and European universities? That question comes
so these
from
are
your friend Charlie Rose.
Yeah, so Charlie, these are two separate questions. I'll try to answer them. So first of all, about India and
Charlie
China.
Rose might want to mute yourself in the meantime, though. Thank you.
Yeah, regarding India and China, look, let's not forget the United States was and remains Israel's ally, number one ally. Not only that, in the minds of the Israelis, they're part of the United States. Americans may not see that, but Israelis think they're part of the United States. And so your president is our president. I know that our research in the United States indicates that Israel is a very distant brand for the average Americans. The average American doesn't think that he or she know Israel very well, but Israelis see themselves as Americans, and that's why they're offended, by the way, when they're being asked to apply for a visa and they're being told, call us again in 2023, and things of that nature. But what I'm trying to say is that nothing that will happen along the line between Israel and China or between Israel and India will happen without the consent of the United States. We're back to the policy of no daylight in the relations between the countries. And I know that the Biden administration is really interested in working very closely with Bennett and Lapid, and I think that we'll see great things. Israel has tremendous agenda with both China and India, especially with India. That India is a serious ally of Israel. As long as it's not about military, as long as it's not about national security, I think the Americans will be okay with it. Regarding the delegitimization, it's a big problem. It's a big problem that has historical roots. Zionism was never a big hit among American intellectuals and not among European intellectuals. Let me remind you that Zionism was not a big hit among Jews. The vast majority of Jews did not support Zionism. That's why your grandparents came to America and not came to Palestine like my grandparents. My family came here in 1874. How many Jews came to Palestine in 1874? Most of the Jews that could leave Eastern Europe, they left to US or Canada. And no wonder, because Palestine had nothing to offer. There was nothing here. And so people wanted to go to the New World. Would you blame them? I don't blame them. So, so the biggest criticism against Israel, the biggest doubts when it came to Israel's existence came from Jews. And we have to remember that. And so what's the solution? The solution is very simple. We live in a world of experiential marketing. We need to develop programs similar to Birthright with influencers, with academics. I know that in the world of academics, we have a problem with social studies. We have a problem with the humanities. It is incumbent upon us to bring all the PhD candidates to visit Israel. There aren't too many of them. In the United States, I would assume there are 1,500, 2,000 PhD candidates that write dissertations in those areas. Let's bring them all to Israel. We have nothing to hide, but we're not doing it. And I've not seen not even one Jewish organization out there that says this is our goal. Study abroad. That's how you change it. 1 million American students studying abroad pre-COVID every year. How many of them end up in Israel? Less than 3,000. 1 million American kids travel to study abroad every year. How come we're not able to get 100,000 every year? Forget the economic impact, but that's the way you do it. That's the way to change the conversation about Israel. But we're not doing it. The country is obsessed with advocacy. There are organizations out there, they believe it's all about presenting the facts. Facts, I say this sadly, we live in a world where facts are less important. It's about the ability to tell a story. You know, again, I mentioned David Milch. My friend always quotes Israeli historian Yuval Noah Harari, who speaks about the reason why the Jews were able to survive is because they were a civilization of storytellers. And it's all about the ability to tell a story today, to be attractive, to be compelling, to be inspirational. Why do you think TED Talks is such a big hit? Because TED Talks are inspirational. And that's what we need to do. And Israel could become a source of inspiration to people. And so let me just end with one sentence on this, Charlie. If you remember the study that we did with Malcolm Online back in 2011 or 2012, that study showed that there's a massive support base for Israel in America of about 22% of the American people that say they have a strong emotional connection to Israel. And it was mostly religious, mostly Protestant. And then on the other end, you had 8% of people that said, whatever it is Israel is trying to sell, I'm not buying. These people were highly critical of Israel, 8%. By the way, the vast majority of the 8% rejected the BDS narrative, rejected the delegitimization narrative. The big question is, what do we do with the 70% in the middle? My entire argument is that when someone says to you, I don't believe you have a right to exist, at least you know where they stand. The problem is the 70% in the middle that develop the inability to relate to Israel. That's the problem. They just don't understand who we are. Right? When John Oliver or Trevor Noah and all the late night talk show hosts during the last Gaza confrontation speak about war crimes, have no idea what they're talking about. Right? Accusing Israel of committing war crimes, have no idea what they're talking about.
Ido,
right?
can I make one comment?
Sure.
This delegitimization BDS movement is broadening out and going to younger and younger people. It's a poison. It's a poison that has to be stopped in some way. This poison is very, very dangerous.
Right. So as I said before, the way to do it, Charlie, is to create a platform And I know that the Lapin Foundation in Boston, which is again an organization affiliated with the Milch Foundation, the Lapin Foundation in Boston is doing it with high school kids, and they started way before Birthright. But there are other organizations like the Jewish National Fund, the America-Israel Friendship League, ITREC, Vibe Israel. These are all organizations that bring groups to Israel, and we need to help them. We need to help them bring more and more people to see Israel for themselves. Back to you, Dodi, with more questions.
Okay, from my friend Esther Schifrin, Israel's PR needs developing. And secondly, how does the squad, you know the squad, the 4 women in Congress, affect Israel with their anti-Semitic remarks and actions?
Well, I think we'll start with the second question. I don't think they have any impact on Israel. I think they have impact on the Democratic Party. And the big question is, what's their, one of the reasons that the Arab parties in Israel, the Arab politicians in Israel, were so disliked by the Israeli public is because they decided to rally around the Palestinian issue. Whereas their constituency, I wouldn't say couldn't care less about the Palestinians, but had different issues. They had issue with employment, they have issues with education, they have issues, all sorts of issues, healthcare issues, major drug problem in the Arab society. And here you have our representatives in the Knesset are rallying around the Palestinians. I think the same thing is happening with the squad. Ilhan Omar and Tlaib, Rashida Tlaib, they think mistakenly that they were elected to serve the Palestinians in the U.S. Congress. And they were elected to serve their constituency, and I think is a big deal. So their impact is, I think, mostly local. Israelis never heard of them, don't care about them. I don't think they have an impact in that way. Regarding the comment about public relations, look, it's not about public relations, it's about the overall well-being of the brand. Israel's brand suffered for many, many years from neglect. We have great fundamentals, as I mentioned before, creativity, knowledge, and all we need to do is broaden the conversation. As long as the conversation is narrow and one-dimensional, and it's all about the conflict, Israel is in a built-in disadvantage. You have to understand that. There's no way to win that. No way to win that. Using force today is viewed as illegitimate, no matter whether it's police force in Ferguson or whether it's military force in Gaza. Force is out of the question. And we have to understand that. Israel is in a mental jet lag. Israel is behaving like a country that is completely disconnected from the global agenda. There's a new audience out there. Force is illegitimate. Now find a way to broaden the conversation so that it's not just about force. It's not just about conflict. That's the key. And maybe we'll take one last question, Dodi.
Okay. Well, we have a question that's sort of being answered. Have the Israelis write a screenplay casting Tom Hanks, Ben Affleck, Matt Damon, Meryl Streep, a 2021 version of Exodus, to which Ben May says, a redo of the Mickey Marcus story. Stay tuned, working on it.
Well, the remake of Exodus and the remake of Cast a Giant Shadow, 2 great movies. I wish it would happen, but there's so many other great movies being produced about real lives, real families, real, Israelis are just learning how to tell a story in a very compelling way. And you'll see the best is yet to come. I happen to be the chairman of one of Israel's film funds, and I see some of the stuff that the young Israeli talents are developing. It's just incredible, really is incredible. And you'll enjoy soon on your tablet, not on your screen, soon on your tablet, on your iPad. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a true delight. I can't wait for our next meeting.
Well, I have a feeling you're going to get a 3rd invitation, but don't hold your breath yet. We have several things that we have to push into our calendars, but thank you. It was very well thought out, a wonderful, wonderful program. I didn't quite know where you were going. I never doubt that you will go in the right direction for all of us to learn and think about a lot that you've told us. thank you all from wherever you have tuned in, not just our Leo Beck Temple crowd. You have a lot of applause here. You can't hear it, but I can see it.